It was early in the morning, just around the time the sun was beginning to warm up the city streets. A light breeze blew through the air, carrying the smell of fresh coffee from a nearby cafe. For most people, it was just another regular day, but for her, this was no ordinary morning. The woman dressed in a professional suit had already had a busy start. She had been up for hours, preparing for an important charity event in the city. She was used to handling pressure and juggling multiple responsibilities, and today was no different. She was driving her car through a quiet, mostly residential neighborhood, her mind focused on the upcoming event. It wasn't the first time she'd been involved in organizing something big, and she knew the role she played was important. She was respected in the community, not just for her work, but for the way she held herself, always calm, always collected. As she made a turn, she noticed a police patrol car pull up behind her, its lights flashing. The woman didn't panic. It wasn't an unusual sight. Like anyone else, she had been pulled over a few times before, and every time, she followed the same routine: stay calm, be polite, and wait for the officer to do his job. The police officer, a young man with short hair and a stiff formal uniform, got out of the car and walked towards her window. He didn't smile. His expression was serious, almost stern. She didn't mind. After all, it was his job to be alert and professional. He leaned in to speak to her, his voice firm but not rude. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" She raised an eyebrow, not in frustration, but in a way that showed she was thinking. She hadn't noticed anything unusual. The woman was a careful driver, always aware of her surroundings, and nothing about the road had seemed out of the ordinary. Still, she nodded and answered calmly, "No, officer. I'm not sure." The officer didn't give much of an explanation. He simply asked for her license and registration, which she handed over without hesitation. She remained in the car, watching as he took the documents from her and began to look them over. There was nothing in his manner that suggested anything out of the ordinary, at least not at first. But as the minutes passed, she started to feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The officer was quiet, almost too quiet. It was like something was off, but she couldn't quite place what. She glanced out the window, the morning traffic still moving along as usual. Her thoughts drifted for a moment, then snapped back to the situation. She noticed the officer walking back to his patrol car, his head slightly lowered as if deep in thought. He was taking longer than usual, more time than she thought was needed to check her documents. She wondered what the holdup was. The woman was used to being treated with respect, especially in her line of work. She had spent years earning the trust of her community and the people around her. But something about the way the officer was acting felt different. It wasn't necessarily hostile, but there was a kind of suspicion in the air that she could feel without him saying a word. The longer he stayed in his car, the more her unease grew. She sat back in her seat, arms crossed, trying to read the situation. When the officer finally returned, he wasn't holding anything in his hands. His expression had changed. The polite but distant tone was gone. Instead, he seemed almost uncertain. He looked at her with a new intensity, as if he had just realized something important, but was still trying to process it. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the woman spoke first. She had decided it was time to address what was on her mind. The silence between them felt awkward, and she didn't want it to continue. "Officer," she said calmly, her voice steady but carrying a hint of authority. "Is there a problem here?"
"Why the long delay?"
The officer paused as though her words had caught him off guard. He blinked, glanced down at the papers in his hand again, then back at her, clearly trying to figure out how to respond. It was clear now that there was something going on behind his eyes, a mix of confusion and uncertainty. The way he was acting didn't make sense, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't expected her to speak up. "Well, ma'am," he began slowly, looking down at her documents once again. "I just wanted to double-check a few things." His voice was softer now, less confident, more unsure of himself. He was no longer the assertive officer he had been moments before. She raised an eyebrow. The situation was taking an unexpected turn, and now her curiosity was piqued. She had seen this type of behavior before. She knew that sometimes people, especially in positions of authority, could be quick to judge or question her based on nothing more than her appearance. But she wasn't just anyone. She had a strong presence in the community, and she had learned to deal with moments like these. Still, the feeling of being questioned without reason left a sour taste in her mouth. There was something in the officer's demeanor that told her he wasn't just doing his job. He was doing something more, something personal perhaps. It wasn't hard to guess why. She had spent enough time in her position to know that certain people had certain assumptions about her, simply because of how she looked. "Do you need to see my ID again?" she asked, her voice neutral but with a touch of curiosity. The officer glanced up at her, then looked back at her documents. She could see him start to check the name again, as if something had finally clicked for him. It was clear that he had been so focused on her appearance and the situation that he hadn't taken the time to really process who she was. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but this time, she could tell something was different. His body language had shifted completely, as if a light bulb had gone off in his head. He looked at her with a mix of realization and embarrassment. I'm sorry," the officer stammered. "I didn't realize who you were." "Please go ahead." The woman could tell that he was struggling to regain his composure. His face turned a little red and he quickly stepped back, almost as if to give her space, but she could see he was uncomfortable with what had just happened. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The woman remained calm, though her mind was racing. She had seen this type of thing happen before. People who didn't take the time to look beyond her skin, beyond her appearance, and instead jumped to conclusions based on outdated ideas or unconscious biases. It wasn't just frustrating, it was exhausting, but she wasn't about to let it ruin her day. She took a deep breath, reminded herself that this wasn't her first encounter with prejudice, and that she had the power to turn this moment into something better. After all, she was more than just someone to be judged based on a first impression. The officer stepped away from her car, his hands held slightly out, almost as if to say he was done with the stop. He gave her one last quick apology before returning to his patrol car, and the woman could feel her frustration begin to fade away. She wasn't angry, no, she was used to this. But it did make her wonder, how often did these situations happen, and how many people like her were unfairly judged just because of how they looked or the assumptions others made. The woman exhaled, glanced in her rearview mirror one last time, and drove off. She didn't let the moment linger in her thoughts for long. She had more important things to focus on. But deep down, she knew that this encounter was only the beginning of something that needed to change. She could feel it in the air. This wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something that affected everyone. As she drove away, the city streets stretched ahead, quiet and undisturbed. The woman's mind was already shifting toward the day ahead, the work she needed to do. But this moment, as small as it seemed, would stay with her. She had learned that sometimes change starts with a single moment, one conversation, one interaction. And today that moment had come for her. The air around her felt heavier now, as if the weight of what had just happened hung in the silence between them. She had always been someone who took things in stride, but the way the officer had treated her earlier was starting to settle in her mind, more uncomfortable than she had expected. She knew that people sometimes judged her based on assumptions, but it wasn't often that she found herself face to face with someone who didn't even give her the benefit of the doubt. Someone who just assumed she was another person to be questioned, another person to be scrutinized. As she drove away, her thoughts drifted. The sun was now higher in the sky, casting a warm glow on the streets, but her mind wasn't quite in the same place. She thought about the officer, the way his attitude shifted when he realized who she was. She didn't know whether to feel sorry for him or just disappointed. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her, and it likely wouldn't be the last. There were always those moments when people would look at her and assume she didn't belong, or didn't deserve to be in a particular place or position. But what bothered her most was the fact that this officer, in a position of authority, had let his own assumptions cloud his judgment. He hadn't taken the time to recognize her as someone worthy of the same respect and dignity he would show any other person. For a moment she tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the task ahead. She had a charity event to organize, and there was no time to waste on something like this. But the more she thought about it, the more the situation seemed to linger in her mind, like a pebble stuck in her shoe. She couldn't ignore the injustice of it all, not when it was something she'd experienced more times than she cared to admit. She couldn't help but think about the officer's behavior and what it said about the world they were living in. It wasn't just about her. It was about the countless other people who were treated like that every day. The ones who didn't have the same privileges, the ones who were already judged before they even had a chance to prove themselves. As she turned a corner, she saw a group of children playing on the sidewalk. They were laughing, their voices rising in the air, innocent and carefree. She watched them for a second, reminded of how simple things could be. But in that same instant, something deep inside her stirred, a quiet anger, a feeling that things needed to change. Her mind raced again, and this time, she couldn't help but think of how she would address this with her husband, the police chief. She had seen the way he ran the department, his commitment to doing things the right way, to serving the community with fairness and integrity. But even he, as the chief, couldn't be everywhere at once. He couldn't control every officer on his team. She had been with him long enough to know that change didn't come easily, especially when it was built on deeply rooted habits and biases. Still, something had to be done. She couldn't just let this moment slip by as if it were nothing. She had been thinking about these issues for a long time, but now, it felt like the right time to speak up, to push for something better. Her husband had always believed in the power of dialogue, of being open to change. Maybe, just maybe, she could help him see the deeper problem. After all, she wasn't just a bystander in all of this. She had a voice, and with that voice, she could make a difference. The question was where to start. How could she help shift things in the right direction? The woman found herself pulling into a parking lot, her car slowing to a stop. She had arrived at the location of the charity event, a modest building that had been set up to serve as a meeting space for the local community. It was a place where people came together, a place that had always been at the heart of everything she worked for. But even as she parked and got out of the car, her thoughts were still on the officer, still on the question of how to address the larger issues that had been bubbling in the background for so long. She walked inside, her heels clicking softly on the floor. The space was buzzing with energy. Volunteers were setting up tables, sorting through donations, and preparing for the event that was just a few hours away. It felt good to be in this space, surrounded by people who were eager to make a difference. But in the back of her mind, the events of the morning kept creeping in. As she moved through the room, exchanging pleasantries and checking on the preparations, she couldn't help but notice the subtle differences in how people treated her. Some greeted her with smiles, eager to chat, while others barely looked up from their tasks. It wasn't anything personal, she knew that. But still, it was hard to ignore the feeling that, despite her position, there was always a sense of distance from those who didn't know her well. The woman who was the wife of the police chief, the person behind the charity event, wasn't always seen as the same person when she stepped out of the public eye. She was a figure to be admired, to be respected from a distance, but how many people really saw her for who she was? Not just the wife of someone important, not just a name, but a person in her own right. She couldn't help but reflect on how, even in her own community, the subtle biases existed. People treated her based on what they thought they knew about her, based on her position and appearance. The officer's behavior earlier was just one example of how easy it was for people to make assumptions, to decide who someone was without actually taking the time to get to know them. She had spent so many years trying to make a difference, trying to create positive change. But it was moments like these, moments where she saw firsthand how ingrained bias could be, that made her realize just how much work still needed to be done. She couldn't fix everything by herself, but she could start somewhere. She could raise her voice, talk to the right people, challenge the norms that held back progress. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft tap on her shoulder. She turned around and one of the event volunteers smiled warmly at her, offering a clipboard with some last-minute details for her review. The woman took the clipboard, nodding and thanking the volunteer, though her mind was still elsewhere. It was hard to focus entirely on the event when she felt so unsettled by everything that had happened earlier. As she moved to the front of the room to give a quick speech before the event officially started, she found herself taking a deep breath, grounding herself in the present moment. She couldn't let what had happened with the officer define her day. She had a role to play, and there were people here who depended on her leadership. She couldn't afford to let the frustration from earlier spill over into her work, but deep down, she knew that today was just the beginning. The morning's encounter had made something clear to her. It wasn't enough to just sit back and accept things as they were. If she wanted to see real change, if she wanted to help people understand what it meant to truly treat others with respect and dignity, she would have to push harder. She would have to make the conversation happen, even if it meant stepping outside of her comfort zone. With the event about to begin, she straightened up, feeling the familiar rush of energy that came with being in front of a crowd. It was time to focus. But as she looked out at the people gathered before her, she couldn't shake the thought that one small moment, a simple interaction with an officer, had the power to start something bigger than she ever imagined. And that realization, though small, gave her the courage to keep going no matter how difficult it might be. The officer's voice was still in her head. The words, though apologetic, felt hollow. As she continued driving, the thought of the encounter lingered with her, like a storm cloud that wouldn't go away. She had been patient, calm, and even understanding in the moment. But now, as the car rolled on, her mind began to swirl with the unfairness of it all. Why had the officer treated her that way in the first place? Was it just because of how she looked? Was it because she was a woman or because she was black? Or was it simply the badge of authority that gave him the power to make assumptions? She tried to shake the feeling, but it stayed with her, heavy in the air. She had been on the receiving end of judgment like this countless times before, but today felt different. There was a sense of injustice in how quickly the officer had treated her as if she didn't belong, as if she were just another person to be questioned, not someone worthy of respect or trust. But then, the moment of realization, when he realized who she was, had completely shifted his demeanor. Suddenly, the respect, the apology, the quick exit from the situation had followed. It made her wonder, why did it take him finding out her identity for him to show any real courtesy? She understood the importance of authority, of law enforcement doing their job, but wasn't the core of the job about treating people fairly and equally? She thought about how many others had probably been in her shoes, treated like they didn't belong simply because someone assumed something about them. It was a thought she couldn't ignore. But now, as she made her way to the local community center where the charity event would be held, she also found herself thinking of the bigger picture. She had spent years advocating for equality, for a better, more inclusive community, but even she, with all her work and all her knowledge, couldn't escape the biases that were often invisible to many people, especially those in positions of power. The officer hadn't even realized who she was, and that alone spoke volumes about the gap in understanding and respect that existed in society. When she arrived at the community center, the place was buzzing with activity. Volunteers were setting up tables, hanging up decorations, and preparing the space for the evening. The room was alive with energy, filled with people who shared the same goal, making a positive impact in the community. But even as she stepped into the room, she couldn't entirely shake the thoughts of the morning's encounter. It wasn't just the officer's reaction that bothered her. It was the realization that people in positions of power often didn't see her for who she truly was. She wasn't just the wife of the police chief. She wasn't just someone to be recognized when it suited them. She had spent her life proving herself, building a reputation and earning respect in a community that wasn't always kind to people like her. But in the eyes of that officer, she had been just another black woman to question, someone he felt he could treat like an outsider, until he realized who she was. The feeling was frustrating but not surprising. She had learned long ago that the world sometimes saw her only for what they thought they knew: her appearance, her position, her race. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed the worst about her, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But what made this situation stand out was the officer's complete lack of awareness. He had seen her as an unknown, and that unknown was a threat to him. Until he knew her identity, he couldn't offer the basic respect that should be given to anyone, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. But she wasn't angry. No, not exactly. She was more disillusioned, disappointed that this kind of bias was still so deeply ingrained in how people interacted with one another. That was the real struggle. It wasn't just one officer. It was the systems, the patterns, the unspoken assumptions that ran through every interaction, every moment when people looked at someone like her and decided she didn't belong. Not until they were proven wrong. As she made her way to the front of the room, she greeted the volunteers and quickly began checking in on the event preparations. Despite everything swirling in her mind, she had work to do. People were relying on her to keep everything moving, to ensure that the event would go smoothly. She smiled, exchanged pleasantries, and tried to push the earlier incident to the back of her mind. But in the quiet moments between talking to people, her mind would always return to the officer. What if he hadn't known who she was? The thought stuck with her. She wondered if, had her identity not been revealed, the interaction would have ended differently. She knew that it was likely he wouldn't have given her a second glance, wouldn't have apologized, wouldn't have treated her with any of the respect she was due. She was more than just a name on a piece of paper. She was a human being, someone with a life, with a purpose, with a voice, and yet he hadn't seen that. He had only seen someone to question, someone to challenge without any regard for who she actually was. It was moments like these that reminded her how much work there still was to do in changing how people saw each other, how they treated each other. But there was something else nagging at her, something deeper. As she stood among the volunteers and helped them finish setting up, the feeling that had started to grow in her chest earlier began to take shape. This wasn't just about her anymore. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how many people were in her position. How many Black people, how many women, how many everyday people face this kind of judgment and bias every day, simply because someone decided they weren't worthy of respect until their identity was proven. The realization struck her with a sudden force. She didn't want to just sit by and let this be another example of a situation that passed by without any change. She couldn't just forget about the officer's behavior, even though he had apologized. What about the people who didn't have the luxury of a name that could change everything? What about those who didn't have the connections or the influence to make someone look twice at them, to rethink their assumptions? The truth was, she couldn't let it go, and she shouldn't have to. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the event coordinators approached her with a clipboard, needing a quick approval for a few last-minute changes. The woman looked up, nodded, and took the clipboard. The task at hand was simple enough, but her mind was still far away, caught in the tangled thoughts of the morning's encounter. She signed off on the changes, but inside, something was starting to shift. There was a fire within her now, one she couldn't ignore. As she moved to the front of the room to prepare for the speech she was about to give, she stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath. She knew that in this space, in front of this crowd, she could make a difference. She didn't just have the responsibility of being a leader. She had the power to use her voice for change, to raise awareness, and to challenge the biases and assumptions that had been so carelessly put on her earlier that day. The speech she was about to give wouldn't be just about the event. It would be about something bigger, something more important. It was time to speak up about what had happened. Not just because it had happened to her, but because it happened to so many others, and that was something she couldn't stay silent about. Her hands gripped the podium, and as the room fell silent, she looked out at the faces before her. It was time to speak up. As the event began, the room settled into a quiet anticipation. People took their seats, and the hum of conversation slowly faded. She stood at the front of the room, waiting for her moment, the weight of the morning's event still on her mind. Even though she had tried to focus on the task at hand, the earlier encounter with the officer kept creeping into her thoughts, like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. She had been in this situation countless times before, standing in front of a crowd, ready to speak. It was what she did. But today, something was different. Her heart was pounding a little faster, her thoughts a little more jumbled than usual. She had prepared for this moment in the past, but now it felt like something bigger was at stake. The words she had practiced were important, but they didn't feel enough. She needed to speak not just as an organizer, not just as someone leading this charity event, but as someone who had lived through countless moments of being judged, dismissed, or misunderstood. She glanced at the faces in the crowd, most of them familiar, friends, colleagues, and community members who had supported her efforts for years. But there was also a growing sense of something else, something deeper. She wasn't just standing in front of these people as a figurehead of a charity. She was standing as someone who had seen and experienced things that many others never had. The room had grown quiet, and she could feel the energy shift. It was time to speak. Time to address not just the event, but something far more important. She had to address the biases, the assumptions, and the lack of understanding that were so deeply ingrained in society. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice steady but full of purpose. "Thank you all for coming today," she began. The crowd responded with warm smiles and nods. It was a welcoming atmosphere, one she had always felt comfortable in, but today, her words would be different. This event is about more than just raising funds or creating awareness. It's about creating real change, she continued. It's about standing together and recognizing that we all have a part to play in making this community a better place. The crowd listened intently, their attention on her as they always were. But inside she knew she was saying something deeper than just the usual thank you speech. Her mind still flashed back to the officer. She had been treated with suspicion, judged by how she appeared rather than who she was. But she wasn't the only one. There were so many people out there who faced similar assumptions, who were treated unfairly because of what others thought they knew about them. "I want to take a moment," she said, her voice growing a little stronger, "to speak about something that's been on my mind for a while. It's something that affects more people than we care to admit, something that we don't always see, but that's there, in our daily interactions. It's something that, frankly, we need to do better about." The room was still. People were waiting for what would come next. She could feel their eyes on her, and for a brief second, the room felt bigger, as if her words had the power to reach farther than just this group. She wasn't just speaking to the people in the room. She was speaking to anyone who had ever been judged, to anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. "You see," she went on, "this morning, I had an encounter with an officer, and at first he treated me like anyone would. But then, when he found out who I was, his entire attitude changed. Suddenly I was someone to be respected, someone to be treated differently. But the truth is, it shouldn't take knowing my name or my position for anyone to treat me with respect." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room was quiet, but she could feel the tension in the air. She wasn't sure how they would react to this, but she didn't care. It wasn't about how they would feel. It was about how she felt, how all those countless moments of unfairness, those assumptions, had built up into something that couldn't be ignored anymore. "Now, I'm not sharing this story to make anyone feel bad, and I certainly don't want to attack anyone. But what I do want is for us to realize that this kind of thing happens every day. It happens to people based on how they look, where they come from, and yes, sometimes even based on their name or their race. We're all guilty of making assumptions even when we don't mean to, but we need to do better. We need to see people for who they are, not just what we think they are." She could feel a shift in the room, a subtle movement of heads nodding, the kind of understanding that comes when people are ready to hear something real. Her voice softened as she continued. "It's not just about being a good person, it's about being better. We need to break these biases, not just for us, but for the next generation, for everyone who feels they have to fight harder than others to prove their worth." Her heart was racing now, but she felt more alive than she had all day. She wasn't just standing up in front of a crowd anymore. She was sharing a part of herself, a part that had been hiding for too long. She wasn't the only one who felt this way. She knew that. There were so many people who had their own stories to tell, but not enough people listening. She went on. "I've spent a lot of time working on issues of equality, of making sure everyone has a fair chance. But even in our own community, even among those we trust, we still see these divisions. People are judged before they even get a chance to speak. I'm here to tell you that it's time for us to challenge those judgments, to push for change that doesn't come from just talking about it, but from really doing something about it." The room was still, but the energy had shifted. She wasn't just a leader. She was a voice, and that voice was powerful. As she looked out at the faces in the room, she realized how important it was for her to speak up, not just for herself, but for everyone who felt they had to hide their truth. "There's so much work to be done," she said, her voice steady but with a new sense of purpose. "But it starts with us, right here, right now. We all have a responsibility to treat people as they deserve to be treated, equally, fairly, with respect. It's not about our titles, our roles, or our positions. It's about being human." She paused for a moment, letting the silence fill the space. Then she smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "And if we can do that, if we can make sure that no one ever feels like they don't belong, then we've done something that truly matters." She stepped back from the podium. The crowd now silent, but their energy had shifted. There was something in the air, something she couldn't quite name, but she could feel it. A change was happening. Slowly, but it was happening. As the applause broke out, she felt a wave of relief mixed with something else. Hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, her words had reached someone, and that was a start. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations, laughter, and small moments of connection. The event was a success, and while the cause was important, what stuck with her the most wasn't the money raised or the people who showed up. It was the conversations that happened afterwards, the moments when people came up to her and shared their own experiences, their own struggles, and their own hopes for change. She realized then that the work was far from over, but she had made a step, and sometimes that's all it takes to start something bigger. The evening was winding down, but the words from her speech still hung in the air. She could feel the weight of what she had said, and the quiet ripple of realization spreading through the room. People were still chatting in small groups, but there was a different kind of energy now, a shift in the way they were interacting with one another. It was as if something had clicked in their minds. It wasn't just about the charity event anymore. It was about the larger unspoken truths she had touched on, and for the first time, she felt a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to the success of the event itself. As the last of the guests filtered out of the community center, she stood at the entrance thanking people for attending and wishing them well. There were smiles and handshakes, but there were also a few lingering conversations. People seemed to want to share more, to continue the discussion that had been sparked by her words. It was a good feeling, one that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, change was possible, even if it started with small steps. It wasn't until she was locking up the center, finally ready to head home, that she noticed a couple standing by the entrance, waiting to speak with her. They were older, their faces lined with years of experience, but there was something kind and approachable about them. She recognized them as regular supporters of the charity, but she hadn't seen them around much lately. The woman gave her a warm smile as she approached. "You gave us all a lot to think about tonight," the man said gently. He looked at his wife before turning back to her. "We're proud to support this cause, but I think we all need to do a better job of supporting each other, beyond just giving money." She was taken aback, not by the words themselves, but by the genuine sincerity in their voices. These weren't just polite pleasantries. These were people who were truly reflecting on what she had said. She smiled back at them, feeling a little lighter. "I'm glad it made an impact," she said, her voice soft. "I think a lot of us forget that real change happens when we look at the people around us, not just as part of a group, but as individuals. It's easy to make assumptions, but harder to look past them." The woman nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "You're right," she said. "I've seen that bias too many times in my own life, and it's something I know I need to work on." She paused, then added, "It's not just about changing how we see others. It's about changing how we see ourselves in the process. We all have work to do." Her heart swelled a little at that. It wasn't often that people were willing to admit their own flaws, to own up to the biases they might carry without even realizing it. The woman's words felt like a confirmation that yes, what she had said was getting through. People were listening, and they were starting to challenge their own assumptions. After a few more moments of conversation, the couple finally bid her good night and left. She watched them walk down the path, their figures fading into the night, and she couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope. It wasn't just about what she had said, but how people had responded. They hadn't just heard her, they were actively thinking about it, willing to make changes in their own lives. As she drove home, her mind wandered back to that morning, to the officer who had questioned her papers. She thought about how, in that single moment, she had been reduced to nothing more than an assumption, a stereotype that didn't reflect who she was at all. But now, sitting in her car, driving through the quiet streets, she realized something important. She didn't need anyone's validation. She didn't need people to see her the way she wanted to be seen. What mattered was that she knew who she was, and even more, she was willing to speak up for the people who couldn't speak for themselves. When she got home, the house was quiet. Her family was still out, the evening's activities taking them elsewhere. She put her bag down and walked through the house, her mind still turning over the conversations from earlier. She thought about how easy it was to get caught up in the busyness of life, to get distracted by all the noise around us. But today, she had chosen to slow down and truly listen to the people around her. She had shared a piece of herself, not just the role she played, but the person she truly was. And that, she realized, was a gift, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been part of that night. She sat down in the living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. It was peaceful, but her mind was still restless. The world wasn't going to change overnight, she knew that. It would take time, lots of it. But she believed in the power of small moments, small changes that added up over time. Each conversation, each person who left the event with a new understanding was one more step toward a better future. She wasn't trying to change the world all at once. She was just doing her part, however small, however imperfect it might seem. A few hours later, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, she came across an article about community leaders who had sparked real change through small, consistent efforts. It was a reminder of why she did this work in the first place. It wasn't for the applause or the recognition. It was for moments like tonight, when people took a step back and saw the world with a little more clarity. She put the phone down and leaned back, taking a deep breath. In the silence of her home, with the weight of the day lifting off her shoulders, she realized that even though there was so much left to do, she was on the right path. The conversation had started, and now it was up to everyone to carry it forward. She smiled to herself, knowing that even though the night had come to an end, the real work had just begun.